Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. I'm your host, Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. Thank you for joining me. So real quick, for those of you watching on YouTube, you probably noticed I got some different glasses here. These are actually older glasses. My usual pair got broken recently, and get this, a little bit of a side story. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it. I took my glasses into my optometrist to get new lenses put in, and through the process of replacing the lenses, they broke the frames. And then they came and told me that my lenses were out of warranty. So, they could order them for me, a new pair, and give me 30% off, but it was going to cost like $150. And, I'm thinking, well, I get that they're out of warranty, but you guys are the ones who broke them. So why should I have to pay for replacements? So not really sure how I feel about that. The upside is that they said I could either do that, I could pay for the new pair, or I can bring in my own frames and they would replace the lenses in my own frames. So I took the opportunity to get a new pair of Flying Eyes ophthalmics frames, and I brought those in. So I'm currently getting those new lenses put into the Flying Eyes, and I'm looking forward to getting those back. This is not sponsored by Flying Eyes, although I would be open to it if you're out there listening, Flying Eyes. Looking forward to getting those pair of new ophthalmic sunglasses, and I figured that it would cost more to get lenses made for those frames, and since they were going to do the lenses for free, I guess I may have come out ahead. We'll see. Still not wild about the idea about them wanting to charge me for frames that they broke, but that's neither here nor there in regards to today's topic. I've had at least a few requests lately to put out the ACS review for the commercial pilot check ride. So I'm doing the best I can with the time I have available. We're going to jump into it today, and I will continue trying to put out some more commercial check ride prep podcasts here in the near future. But we're going to get started with Area of Operation 1, Task A today, Pilot Qualifications. All right, so as always, we'll start with the objective. The objective today is to determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with airman and medical certificates, including privileges, limitations, currency, and operating as pilot in command as a commercial pilot. All right. Next, we have our knowledge items. The knowledge item says that the applicant demonstrates understanding of, and we go into the first line item, which is certification requirements, recent flight experience, and record keeping. Now, a lot of this is stuff that you have learned previously through private pilot training and instrument pilot training. Certification requirements, a little bit different in Part 61. These certification requirements can be found in 61-129 and talk about the total hours and experience that you need to have already accumulated or received in order to qualify for your commercial pilot certificate. Basically, in order to qualify for your commercial check ride, first you need to have at least 250 total hours in various aircraft, at least 100 hours of PIC in airplanes, and lots of different sub requirements there. But 250 hours total time. You need to have received at least 20 hours of training in the regards to the things in 61-129, which includes a daytime and a nighttime cross-country, training cross-country. There's certain solo requirements you'll need to have met, like your 5 hours of night VFR solo. And within that, 10 takeoffs and landings at a towered airport at night. Okay, and then 1 solo cross-country that is at minimum 250 miles away from the point of original departure and at least 300 miles in total distance. Okay, so I have other videos on that stuff. You can check one out here. when I did my personal solo cross country for my commercial certificate. But those are kind of the general certification requirements. The things, recent flight experience, all the same things apply. We need to, if we're taking passengers, of course, have 3 takeoffs and landings in the preceding 90 days in the category and class of aircraft you're flying. So if it's a multi-engine airplane, you need to have those in a multi-engine. If it's a single engine, same thing, so on and so forth. And of course, the night requirements of being 3 takeoffs and landings that occur between the time of 1 hour after sunset and 1 hour before sunrise to a full stop. Okay, 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop at night. All right, so those are basically our certification requirements, recent flight experience, record keeping, same thing. You need to keep records in your logbook of anything pertaining to the training required that we just mentioned, the training required to qualify for your certificate, and anything that pertains to your recent flight experience or currency. Okay, your takeoffs, landings, your flight review, your instrument experience, and all that if you're operating IFR. Okay, guys, moving on. And this is where kind of the meat and potatoes happens. And we're going to be spending a lot of time on this. Privileges and limitations of the commercial pilot. All right, so at the surface, the regulations in Part 61 make the privileges and limitations of a commercial pilot seem pretty straightforward. We can read right here in 61-133, it says, privileges. A person who holds a commercial pilot certificate may act as pilot in command of an aircraft that is carrying persons or property for compensation or hire, provided the person is qualified in accordance with this part and with the applicable parts of this chapter that apply to the operation, and for compensation or hire, provided the person is qualified in accordance with this part and with the applicable parts of this chapter that apply to the operation. Sounds like a lot of just redundant words over and over again, but that's all it says. That's the privileges of a commercial pilot. Now, limitations. Here's what it says. Limitations are a person who applies for a commercial pilot certificate with an airplane category or powered lift category rating and does not hold an instrument rating in the same category and class will be issued a commercial pilot certificate that contains the limitation, the carriage of passengers for hire in airplanes on cross-country flights in excess of 50 nautical miles or at night is prohibited. The limitation may be removed when the person satisfactorily accomplishes the requirements listed in 6165. That's the part that describes your instrument rating of this part in the same category and class of aircraft listed on the person's commercial pilot certificate. All right, so basically all that's saying, and the next one, it's simply, we'll go on in a second here, but all that's saying is if you don't have an instrument rating as a commercial pilot, you cannot carry persons on cross-country trips over 50 miles away from the original point of departure, and you cannot carry them at night. Now, notice it doesn't say anything about cargo. It just says you cannot carry passengers for hire, okay? And that's all that it says for limitations in regards to an airplane. There are other limitations in regards to balloon ratings, which we're not going to discuss in this podcast. So that leaves a lot to be interpreted on your part as a commercial pilot. It seems pretty straightforward, but as we know, nothing's really straightforward when it comes to the FAA. There tends to be a lot of gray areas. So with that said, I'm going to preface this by saying nothing I'm saying here should be taken at face value, okay? There's so many gray areas throughout these regulations, sometimes where one thing would be considered acceptable and okay, and other times where perhaps the seemingly same type of activity would not be considered acceptable or okay. Ultimately, you have to do your own research and you have to do your own due diligence and really comes down to, in some respects, your own personal minimums as to the types of jobs and activities you are willing to do for hire, making sure that you are always erring on the side of being conservative to protect yourself. As I always tell all of my commercial students, no matter what the regulations say, no matter what a certain letter of interpretation or advisory circular says, if you are ever in doubt as to the legality or the ethical standpoint of a certain job, okay, or opportunity, ask the FAA. Reach out to your local FSDO, and whatever they say to you, whether it is in the positive or the negatory, get it in writing. Specifically, if it's in the positive, if they say, yeah, that's okay, we approve, which they may not even be that, clear on. They might be just about as clear as mud like everything else. But if they basically say, yes, that's okay, and you decide to go forward with that opportunity, get it in writing. That's the only way you're ultimately going to be able to protect yourself. Even with that said, getting in touch with someone at the FAA who can and will give you an answer could take a long time at best if you are lucky enough to do so at all. So it's not always the easiest process, but always err on the side of caution. Be conservative in your decisions, okay? With that said, let's take a look. So there's a lot of things we could dive into here. There's the issue of common carriage versus private carriage. There's the issue of wet leases versus dry leases. And then there's the issue of the exemptions to all this stuff and what we are allowed to do without an operating certificate, the exemptions to Part 119. There's the issue of operational control. All right, so lots of things to dive into. I'm probably not going to touch on everything right here, right now. What I'm probably going to do is create some additional podcast episodes that dive into each of these individually. But for right now, what I want to look at is Part 119, okay? So I'm going to pull up Part 119. And for those of you who don't know, Part 119 talks about and governs, to some extent, the certification of air carriers and commercial operators. This basically defines what you can do, what you can't do, and what is required in order to do certain things as a air carrier or commercial operator. And when we look at 119.1 in the applicability section, first of all, it just says, this part applies to each person operating or intending to operate civil aircraft for purposes such as an air carrier or commercial operator, or both. When common carriage is not involved. It goes on, it lists a bunch of stuff. I'm not going to read through all of it here, but bottom line is, if we go forward a little bit more to 119.1, Part Echo, it states that except for operations when common carriage is not involved, conducted with any airplane or powered lift having a passenger seat configuration of 20 seats or more, excluding any required crew member seat or payload, blah, blah, blah. Basically what this is saying is that even if you are in a non-common carriage scenario, but your airplane has 20 or more seats or weighs more than 6,000 pounds, then the rest of this part is excluded, okay? All right, so basically, these are the exceptions to needing an operational certificate or an operating certificate under Part 119, which would ultimately either put you somewhere in 135 or 121 territory. So basically, to be exempt, this does not apply to student instruction, nonstop commercial air tours that occur in an airplane, basically within 25 statute miles of the original point of departure. So you can't take off and land anywhere else. You take off and land from one departure point, and you don't go beyond 25 statute miles, and you have to have a certain letter of authorization, and there's a bunch of hoops to jump through to do this, but that's one exemption as well. 3, ferry or training flights. 4, aerial work operations, including crop dusting, seeding, spraying, and bird chasing, banner towing, aerial photography or survey, or firefighting. As well as if you were in a power lift or rotorcraft, there's certain things you could do there, and power line or pipeline patrol. 5, sightseeing flights conducted in hot air balloons or gliders. 6, nonstop flights conducted within 25 statute mile radius of the airport for intentional parachute operations. And then 7 relates to powered lift and rotorcraft flights as well. Okay. So 8, 9, and 10 are all things that get into other parts. We're not going to really talk about that. And of course, 11 is drone work. Okay. But these are all exemptions to Part 119, which means that you don't need an air carrier or commercial operator certificate in order to provide these services. Now, the big one there that probably is most common is flight instruction, right? Student instruction. I, as a flight instructor, don't need any operating certificate. Not only that, but I can advertise my services. I can say, hey, everybody out there, I'm a flight instructor. I'll teach you how to fly. Who wants to learn to fly? And whether they bring their own plane or I bring a plane, it doesn't really matter. I can give flight instruction without any other certificate outside of my flight instructor certificate and my commercial pilot certificate. All right. So that's one big thing that we're able to do. Now, other things like it mentions aerial work, including survey and photography and other things like that. So, the question is, could someone come to you and say, hey, I'm a photographer. I want to get this photo or go around, here in the Pacific Northwest. I want to go around Mount St. Helens. I want to go around Mount Hood, the Cascade Mountain Range, and get photos. Can I pay you to take me to do that? And well, on the surface, yeah. I mean, the answer could be yes. Again, it's gray, and you need to consider your answer. So here's the things that you need to consider, okay? Most of what you're going to be presented with in a check ride scenario from your examiner does not necessarily have a correct, right or wrong answer, just a black and white yes or no. Really, what the examiner is going to be looking for is your thought process, showing that you understand the potential conflicts to a given situation, and the considerations you need to make for a given opportunity. So they're looking for your decision making and your general understanding of things like holding out and common carriage versus private carriage and operational control. But I've got a letter of interpretation here that's just going to, we're going to look at in regards to kind of this photography mission. This is Ray Bonilla from 2017, I believe, or 2011. It's hard to see. The date is a little bit messed up, but I think it's from 2011. Bonilla is Bonilla. And I'm just going to read straight from this interpretation. It says, this letter is in response to May 3rd, 2011 request for legal interpretation regarding aerial work operations and, in particular, seeking clarification of the letter issued by the FAA to Mr. Jeff Lieber, which was a previous interpretation from earlier in 2011. They say, first, we note that after receiving your letter, we reviewed the letter to Mr. Lieber, which reached the conclusion that an aerial photography operation with a passenger for hire on board the aircraft would not be operating in accordance with aerial work exception of Part 119. In other words, that doesn't count. You can't do aerial photography while having a paying customer or passenger on board for another purpose. Or it actually goes on to give the provision if it stopped to refuel at a location other than from where it took off. So basically, this previous letter was asking, hey, would it be okay if we do this aerial photography operation with this passenger on board for hire, if we had to make a fuel stop at a location other than from where we departed. And originally, the FAA said that no, you can't. You have to only take off and land at the place of original departure. However, they're now saying that, and it goes on to say, as a result of this review, we have determined that interim stops are allowed for the limited purpose of meeting aircraft or human needs. So they say, accordingly, we are withdrawing the interpretation issued to Mr. Lieber and issuing this interpretation in its place. Okay, so what we're getting at here is the idea that they could do this operation where they have a paying passenger for the purpose of aerial photography, and should they need to make any stop en route for any purpose related to aircraft or human needs. So obviously, if nature calls, you got to go to the bathroom or something along those lines, a stop could be permissible. If you had to refuel the plane, a stop could be permissible. The key word there being could. Okay, let's keep going here in the letter. It says, in your letter, you described a scenario in which ABC Company is asked by a client to transport survey equipment with the purpose of conducting infrared videography along the length of a power transmission line or pipeline extending for several hundred miles across multiple states. A person not employed by the company is carried aboard the aircraft to operate the survey equipment. The distance covered by the survey requires that the aircraft land periodically, so it may be refueled. The distance also requires that the crew make overnight stops for meals and rest. Okay, so these are aircraft and human needs that we're talking about. It goes on to say that the writer asked 3 questions. He asked 3 questions pertaining to the scenario above. First, may a helicopter operator conducting operations under 119.1, basically this exemption, make a landing to address aircraft or human needs? And I think we've already determined that will be yes. But second, may the person carried aboard the aircraft that operates the survey equipment remain at the location where the survey is concluded, or may he return in the aircraft to the survey starting point? Third, they asked whether the FAA considers an operator to be engaged in common carriage when it holds itself out to the public for hire, but limits the operation of those authorized under 119.1. In other words, is it considered common carriage if you are holding out, if you are advertising services to the public for hire, if those operations all fall under 119.1 Echo 2 or Echo 4. These are the exceptions that we're talking about. Okay, so their answer to these questions are, in regards to landing to address aircraft or human needs. In general, when a flight involves the carriage of persons or property for compensation or hire, the operator is required by Part 119 to hold an air carrier or commercial operator certificate and operate such flights in accordance with the appropriate rules found in Part 121 or 35. Section 119.1 Echo provides an exception to that rule for several categories of operations, such as aerial work operations, which is what we're discussing here. This includes power line and pipeline patrol and aerial photography and nonstop commercial air tours. Okay. Persons conducting operations described in this part do not need to hold a Part 119 operating certificate and may conduct these operations under Part 91 rules. Okay, next paragraph. It goes on to say, however, when these operations have a quote-unquote dual purpose, okay, this is a key term here, folks, dual purpose. When these operations have a dual purpose, meaning, for example, that an operation is conducted for both pipeline patrol and transporting passengers for compensation or hire, then the 119.1 Echo exception would not apply. Okay? You cannot have dual purpose. You can't take a photographer on a aerial photography flight and drop them off at a different airport, because that counts as carriage of passengers for hire. Okay, you have to return to the original point of departure. Let's keep reading here. It says that the FAA has held that an aerial works flight that lands at a place other than where it departed would generally assume a dual purpose. Okay, generally. It says that previous FAA legal interpretations have stated that if the operator takes off on a surveying flight under the aerial work exception, that person must be deemed to recognize that no landing other than at the origin point is permitted, and they should inform the passengers of that before takeoff. It goes on to say that likewise, the FAA has held that aerial photography operations assumed a dual purpose when a flight landed at a destination different from the point at which it departed. Okay? However, love that word, however, the FAA has also recognized an exception to the general rule for landings for aircraft or human needs. Okay? And there's a bunch of references in here for other letters of interpretation and legal definitions that you can look up and refer to. But it says that the administrator concedes that a landing for the purpose of aircraft refueling or human needs would not take the flight out of the aerial photography exception. In other words, it's okay if you have to stop to refuel or use the bathroom, or in some extreme cases, perhaps even rest overnight or eat food. Okay? It goes on to say, accordingly, an aerial work flight that meets the exceptions articulated in 119.1 Echo 4 could land at a location other than from which it departed and remain under the exception to Part 119 if the stop at the non-departure point location is limited to refueling or human needs. In other words, you can't do anything else at all. If this is a photography flight, you need to make sure that your clients, your passengers, are not doing photography on the ground, because this is an aerial photography flight, not a ground photography flight. If you take them someplace, land, they get out and start taking photos or video, well, now you've transported them as passengers for hire to a different location for them to do things there. That is not aerial photography because it's not taking place in the air. Okay? So it needs to be limited to strictly those aircraft or human needs. Operators would be prohibited from picking up additional passengers or property, and no work such as pipeline inspection, photography, or filming would be permitted while the aircraft is on the ground. Okay? Moving on, it says, you asked the same question pertaining to nonstop commercial air tours operated pursuant to 119.1 Echo 2. So basically, this is just saying they're asking about the commercial air tours, okay? And you got to remember those commercial air tours within a 25 statute mile radius need to have a letter of authorization. The employees need to go through certain drug testing, and certain aircraft numbers need to be basically registered that you're going to use. So this is not the same type of thing. And it basically says that the FAA would not anticipate the need for refueling or human needs during such a flight, because you're not going beyond 25 miles from where you departed. And then it goes on to say that additionally, if such stops are made, they must not be used as a means of permitting passengers to explore or tour a location on the ground. Okay? Doing so would have the effect of creating a dual-purpose flight for which a Part 119 operating certificate would be needed. All right. Second question is pertaining to the return of the passenger to the survey starting point. I think we know the answer to this already, But basically it just says, he asked whether the person carried on board the aircraft to conduct the aerial survey may remain at the location where the survey is concluded. And they say that as discussed above, if the flight takes on a dual purpose, then it would need to be conducted under an operating certificate. So bottom line, that person needs to be returned to the point of original departure. They cannot be dropped off anywhere. And then lastly, number 3, in regards to the common carriage question, it says, finally, you asked whether the FAA considers the ABC company to be engaged in common carriage if it holds itself out to the public for hire, but limits those operations to the exceptions authorized under 119.1 Echo 2 or Echo 4. It says that a person is engaged in common carriage when 1, holding out a willingness to 2, transport persons or property, 3, from place to place, and 4, for compensation. I don't know why they put numbers in the middle of this, but if we just read it, it says a person is engaged in common carriage when holding out a willingness to transport persons or property from place to place for compensation. Okay, and that you can see or read more about in an Advisory Circular 120-12A, which we'll probably be looking at in another episode here. But it says that whether or not ABC Company is a common carrier, it would, at a minimum, be considered a commercial operator because it engages in the carriage of, engages in the carriage by aircraft in air commerce of persons or property. Okay. Accordingly, but for the exceptions of 119.1 Echo 2 and Echo 4, its operations would need to be conducted pursuant to a Part 119 operating certificate. So, what does that mean? No, really, I'm asking. I don't know what that means. You guys know? That is the FAA for you, folks, giving answers to questions clear as mud. So, basically, the way I'm interpreting this, and again, this is my interpretation of the FAA interpretation, is that it states, again, accordingly, but for the exceptions of 119.1 Echo 2 and Echo 4, that you would need to have a 119 operating certificate because in this case, ABC Company is considered at least a commercial operator. All right, it's they're basically saying the question being asked is, are they engaging in common carriage? And the answer the FAA is giving is that whether or not they're technically engaging in common carriage, they would be considered a commercial operator and therefore need a 119 operating certificate, but for the exceptions in 119 Echo 2 and Echo 4. So it's clear as mud, like I said. Very hard to get a clear answer, and I think they kind of do that on purpose. Bottom line is that I would say, like I mentioned earlier, if you are going to engage in any type of job like this, or if you're going to think of starting a company to offer these types of services, talk to the FAA, go to your local FSDO, and whatever they say, get their answer in writing. So Part 119 has the list of exceptions there of jobs you can do without needing an operating certificate. Again, bottom line, as long as you are not moving a person or a piece of property from one place to another and leaving them there, in general, any of these exceptions should be fine. But that is, again, the conversation you want to have with your DPE without giving necessarily any black or white answer, because as we've seen, there really aren't any black or white answers when it comes to the FAA. All right, guys, so that's a little bit about the privileges and limitations. Let's move on to medical certificates. So, of course, anytime you're working for hire as a pilot, the medical requirements are going to be the most stringent, at the very least requiring a Class 2 medical. Most air transport if you're working for an airline or Part 135, especially as pilot in command, is going to require a Class 1 medical. So just like we discussed in the private pilot ACS breakdown, you need to know the different classes of medicals and specifically how long the privileges are good for. One of the common mistakes is that somebody says, oh, my Class 1 medical is good for 12 months because I'm under 40, and after 12 months it turns into a Class 3 medical. Well, no. It does not turn into a Class 3 medical. The ink on the paper still says Class 1, but your Class 1 privileges have expired and been downgraded to Class 3 privileges, okay? So, just a quick recap. If you are under 40, your Class 1 privileges are good for 12 calendar months. After that, they go down to Class 3. Your Class 2 privileges are also good for 12 months, regardless of your age. And after that, they go down to Class 3. Your Class 3 medical privileges, if you are below 40, are good for 60 months, 60. And if you are above 40, they're good for 24 calendar months, okay? So that's the basics you need to know for your medical certificates and class. One thing to keep in mind too is if you are over 40, your Class 1 medical privileges are good for only 6 calendar months, at which point they get downgraded to Class 2 privileges for an additional 6 months, comprising a total of 12 months of Class 2 privileges, okay? So that's if you're over 40. All right, continuing on, documents required to exercise commercial pilot privileges. These aren't going to be much different than what you are required to have to exercise any pilot privileges. Of course, you're going to need your medical. You're going to need your photo ID with you. You're going to need your pilot certificate. Beyond that, if you're working for an airline, you might need some credentials to get through security at the airport, but that's about it. Nothing too different there as far as exercising commercial pilot privileges versus private pilot privileges when it comes to being pilot in command. All right, finally, guys, basic med privileges and limitations. So I'm not going to dive too far into this. We've talked about basic med before. Essentially, basic med is still a good thing for you to have as a commercial pilot, because the one thing I think I've mentioned before that so many people don't understand about basic med is that basic med is independent and separate of any medical you hold. So while you can't be a commercial pilot or do commercial operations strictly on basic med, let's say you still have your flight instructor certificate and you may want to give flight instruction on the side or as you're available. Let's say one day your medical gets pulled for some reason, whether it's a just temporary disqualification or, you get injured or something, they pull your medical, at least temporarily. Well, if you don't have basic med, it might make it a little bit harder to even just give flight instruction and make a little money on the side while you figure everything out with your medical. But if you have basic med, you can fall back on that without your medical because, again, it's independent, it's separate. You still have basic med, you can still operate and do things under basic med, like give flight instruction, flight reviews, anything like that. So basic med is a great thing to have as a backup in case you ever lose your medical for any reason and you still need to make some income on the side there. All right, moving on to our risk management section, guys. This is all the same stuff you should be familiar with from private and instrument. Basically, we're looking at the applicant is able to identify, assess, and mitigate risks associated with proficiency versus currency, flying unfamiliar aircraft, or operating with unfamiliar flight display systems and avionics. Okay, these are all things that will usually be presented to you in some sort of scenario given by the examiner. And of course, as always, we know that airplanes are not like cars. You can't just necessarily jump into an airplane you've never flown before and fly it around like you can jump into someone's car you've never driven before. So we want to keep those things in mind, understanding too that the avionics an aircraft has, even if it's the same make and model, the same body of aircraft, a Cessna 172, a Piper Cherokee, whatever, if it has different avionics, that could be something that could present its own risk, especially if you're flying IFR. So making sure you're not only familiar with the external pieces of the airframe, but the internal workings of the airframe is important. Going on to our skills, it says the applicant exhibits the skill to apply requirements to act as pilot in command under visual flight rules in a scenario given by the evaluator. All right, so for this part, I figured we'd go to a couple gouges I have and see what some real examiners out there are asking applicants to talk about with these types of scenarios. All right, so this first scenario states, he said that an owner of a 182 came and asked him if he could hire me as a pilot to fly them around Mount Hood, one of our local mountains around here in the Cascade Mountain Range, and pay me for it. So basically, an owner's coming to you. Perhaps they're not a pilot, but they have a plane, and could they hire you as the pilot to fly them around in their plane for basically a tour or to see the Mount Hood, take photos, whatever the case. So this is a pretty straightforward scenario. Anytime someone comes to you with their own plane, and by their own plane, I mean they're providing the airplane. It doesn't necessarily mean they own it, although if they are not the owners, there's some due diligence you need to do to make sure that you know who owns that plane and how it's being acquired. But in general, if somebody comes to you with an airplane and asks you to be their pilot, there's not an issue with that. You can be hired and paid to fly them around in their airplane. Now, in this particular scenario, they're talking about a 182, which is a high-performance aircraft. So the examiner would probably be looking for you to bring up the fact that you would indeed need a high-performance endorsement to take that job. And scenarios like that are not uncommon. Our next scenario says here, he then gave me a scenario where I would get hired by some corporate company. He said I would be paid to fly some of the employees around. So, a company comes to you again with their own plane and asks you to fly their employees around. This is generally probably okay as long as those employees are not paying for that trip. In other words, they're not paying the owner to take that trip because that would be an illegal charter. But if it's just a company-owned plane and you're flying the executives around in that company plane, that should usually be okay. And I say usually because, again, there's a lot of moving pieces sometimes, a lot of gray areas. You always need to make sure you do your due diligence, okay? Moving on to another examiner's gouge. It's pretty straightforward here. It states, your friend wants to pay you to fly him to PDX, Portland International, so he can make his early morning flight. Can you do this with your commercial certificate? Well, again, if your friend is a plane owner and owns their own airplane and says, hey, I'll pay you, can you take me over to PDX and then fly my plane back to the hangar so I can make my early morning flight? Absolutely. They're providing the airplane. They just want you to fly them so they don't have to pay for parking at PDX for however long they're going to be gone. Easy peasy. You can certainly do that. However, if it was your plane or something to that effect, if you're basically providing the pilot with the airplane, that is considered a wet lease. Okay, you're providing at least one crew member, yourself, along with the aircraft. Okay, versus a dry lease, which we're going to get more into wet and dry leases perhaps later in another episode. But you cannot provide the pilot with the aircraft. But if they're providing the aircraft and you're just the pilot, sure. As long as you have all the proper qualifications, proper endorsements to act as PIC on that flight, drop them off at PDX, get paid, and have a good time. And then finally, the next question was just what kind of flying jobs could you work with your certificate that does not require a operating certificate? And of course, that's our 119.1 Echo. All of those exceptions is basically what he's looking for. So that's pretty straightforward. All right, guys. Well, I don't want to make this too long today. We're going to do some other episodes later, specifically on things like holding out and wet versus dry leases and what it means to be a commercial operator and things like that. But for today, I hope this has been helpful. Bottom line is, hey, as a commercial pilot, if somebody comes to you with a plane, you can certainly fly it for them, assuming you are properly qualified to do so. If they're asking you to fly with your own plane, that gets into operating certificates that need to be begotten. All right. And beyond that, knowing and being familiar with 119.1 Echo and all the exceptions listed there. Those are the things that are pretty straightforward that you can do without an operating certificate. So as long as you can have that conversation with your examiner, you guys shouldn't have any problem on your check ride when it comes to privileges and limitations. If this has been helpful for you, please share it with anyone else you think would find it helpful. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. If you're out there in podcast land, hit that follow button. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we'll see you next time on Centerline.